All right. Hello, listener. While all of our episodes are incredibly important and relevant, today's episode might just change the world. And I'm not saying it will. I am saying that it could, because our guest, our interviewee today is Paul Reitter, the professor of Germanic languages and literature at Ohio State. So if you didn't know if anything good could come out of Ohio, two good things: the Hillbilly Elegy and our project today, which is the new English edition version of Capital. And it's the first new one in, I should have looked this up, 50 years, 47 years, and the third ever English version. So it is a momentous day, or it would be in a literate society. So I am Plastic Pills, joined by Eric, who is our podcast's resident Marxist, and now Paul Reitter. Welcome to your episode.
Yeah, awesome. I actually learned that the 3 English translations thing isn't correct. There's another one.
There is another one, yes, but it's long out of print and nobody reads it. It's very hard to get a hold of, in fact. So I think that, as sad as this is for those translators and a husband-wife team, Cedar and Eden Paul, I have no problem with people saying there are 3.
And translators tend to not badmouth other translators. I don't know if this is just a thing, a respect for the work. I know Engles said that translating Marx into English really sucked specifically. So on behalf of us and the inevitable communist future, we thank you for taking on this burden.
Well, you're welcome. I gave it my best shot.
Clean up those hands. Well, my first question, and you can answer this however you like: are you a Marxist?
Oh, goodness. Well, it depends. This is, of course, going to sound like a pettifogging answer right out of the gate, but it depends on how you define that. Certainly, I subscribe, broadly speaking, to Marx's view of history, his historical materialism. My thinking has been deeply shaped by Marx. If that makes me a Marxist, then I am a Marxist, and have no problem with somebody attaching that label to me. Marx himself famously said toward the end of his life that if one thing is certain, he's not a Marxist, and if being a Marxist is having a set of views about how society should be organized politically that cohere, roughly with Lenin's ideas on such things, then I would say I'm, not a Marxist. I'm devoted, very devoted in my way to Marx, but I don't have much of a history of activism. I've done, some like social service work, but I suppose that for a lot of people, that would mean I'm not a real Marxist. And if they want to say that, okay. And I do think that has, to some extent, affected the reception of the book, because the previous editions, that edition by Cedar and Eden Paul, and maybe I should amend that answer. People should, I say that this is the 4th version. They shouldn't be left out of the picture. I understand why they're left out of the picture. Frankly, their translation is not a very good translation, but they put a lot of work into it, and it's not a terrible translation either. And so they should get credit for having done that. But then they were communists, and the motivation for their translation, which came out in 1928, was that now that Marx's ideas have created led to a revolution, and that communism is this political force in the world, there should be an even more accessible translation. They thought that the first translation, which would later be criticized by Ben Fowkes, who did the most recent English translation in 1976 as a popularizing translation. So Fowkes criticized the first translation for being popularizing and justified doing his translation in 1976, the second major translation, using that. Now we need a serious translation. He said the second translators, English language translators of Capital, they said basically the opposite. They said this translation is too technical, this first translation, and now that Marxism is this big political force in the world, we need a more accessible translation, and that's how they justified it. And it was greeted quite harshly by the main figure in Marx studies at the time, a Russian scholar named or Soviet scholar named David Ryazanov, who would be assassinated by Stalin's agents, high stakes stuff, being in Marx studies at the time. He really trashed this translation right from the start, and it kind of killed it. Even though he hadn't actually read it, he said, I haven't read it, but I just know it's not as good as the one that Engles oversaw. He thought that it was an affront to Engles for somebody to do a retranslation, and when this version, this English version that Engles had overseen, existed. And so that's a little bit of translation history there for you.
Well, that's what today is about, and it's good to know. It's an academic answer, but we do have to vet just to make sure that this is not a bourgeois psyop. Hey, there we go. So you passed the test. No bourgeois psyop here. And speaking of translation, because you said the second, or the one we're all familiar with, let's talk about Fowkes. If our listeners have read it, it's probably that one. Eric and I have both read it. And the first point I wanted to ask you about, this is just a vibes question, because part of reading is vibes. And I thought you might be able to tell me technically what the vibes are, because I thought that your translation, this new one, it seemed a little bit warmer. And I don't even know what warmer means. It's more like less technical, but more like you put it, more cozy. How about that? More cozy. I want to know if you'd agree with that, and what possible reason, technical reason, it would have for seeming that way to an English reader.
Yeah. Well, just to come back very, very briefly to the previous question, don't be alarmed. I promised it's going to be very brief. I kind of felt that I was going on for a while, so I wanted to end, but I hadn't actually gotten to the main point. As you said, an academic answer, guilty. The first translation, the one that Engels oversaw, and the Fowkes translation, they are both self-consciously, straightforwardly Marxist translations, in the sense that they frame the book from the perspective of people who are politically active Marxists pushing for revolution. Ernest Mandel, who wrote the introduction to the Fowkes one, and of course Engels, who wrote the introduction to the first translation. And ours is different in that way, and it's something that people have remarked on, and I don't that doesn't surprise me. And it's part of the book's reception, this difference. But going back to the question you just asked, so the coziness of this translation, I really do think that this corresponds to Marxist style. I'm trying to translate what I hear when I read Marx. And what you hear, of course, depends to some extent on, the text is the text. You're translating the same body of words, but what stands out to you, what informs your reading experience, this depends on lots of things. The reading experiences you bring to it. I bring to Capital reading experiences that Fowkes and more Aveling didn't have, as somebody who has been a specialist in German literature, I think, more than those guys. So even though Fowkes makes a big deal in his preface of attending to the literary qualities of the language, I don't know how much he really does, frankly. And there are various ways in which Marx tries to cozy up the style. Sometimes he's just making little jokes that get lost. Fowkes just that doesn't translate them. Marx says, for example, it doesn't matter to the coat who wears it. It's kind of funny. It's not a big thing. It's not like, you're not laughing out loud. It's not something where you would use that as an example of the humor in Capital. There are more striking examples of humor in Capital, but it's an atmospheric touch, and they add up these things. He makes this little joke about the tailor makes clothes, and thus also the man. And Fawkes translates that as makes people, which is a very direct translation of the German expression. In German, you don't say clothes make the man, you say clothes make people. And
Hmm.
it's not funny in English when you translate it as clothes make people. And so I think that part of the warmth has to do with that, has to do with all these little ways in which Marx is trying to make the experience of reading this book like a little more enjoyable, a little more amusing. And I made an effort to retain them. Why are they not in the why do they get lost in the Fawkes book? Well, part of it may have to do again with the experience that he brings to the text, what he hears, what he finds important. I do think, though, that it has to do to some extent with a desire to make Marx sound like a very sober, scientific analyst of society.
Hmm.
That the technical side is increased for that reason. Maybe some of the neologisms are pulled back on for that reason. There's some odd usages also that just kind of get dropped in Fawkes. Uh,
Hmm.
because they make Marx seem, you know, odd, or they make the text seem odd. I think that
Hmm.
more Aveling and Fawkes, they de-strange the book a bit.
Hmm.
There's a paradox about natural language in Capital, which is that in certain contexts, natural language sounds unnatural. So if you're expecting scholarly language, which you would be from a text that proclaims itself to be extremely scientific, which Capital does in its preface. And when you get a lot of conversational language, jokes, and sarcasm, in that
Rhetorical questions.
yes,
Hmm.
that context, it feels weird. And people have remarked also on like the conversational style of my translation and how it feels informal at times. And instead of let us say, you'll see let's say. But again, I think that I'm really following the German there. So Marx will say, instead of using the formal German expression of like the first person plural, he'll use the second person informal when he'll say like, take this take this, for example. That's informal. That's there, and it's very unusual for the scholarly writing of the time. Marx does not sound like a late 19th century German academic a lot of the time, and so I think that they're a little troubled by this like unnatural use of natural language, this natural language in a context
Hmm.
where you generally don't find it, and they pull back on it in various ways. One thing that Moore Aveling did, and there are other examples of this kind of thing. The Freud translations, that's a famous example of a
Hmm.
often conversational sounding writer being made to sound much more technical in English translation. So they'll take some everyday words and they'll translate them with really fancy words. Uh,
Hmm.
for example, integument is a word that not a lot of people, I think, know, are familiar with.
Hmm.
People were familiar with that in 1887 when the more Aveling translation came out. And Marx uses the word uh, Hülle, which is an everyday word. It means shell or husk, and they translate that in some key moments with integument. In fact, they do it in one of the more rhetorically powerful moments in the book, where Marx is working up to the famous line about the expropriators are expropriated. And you can ask, why do they do that? Well, I think it's about making Marx sound more like you would expect such a writer to sound, but it comes at a cost.
Mm.
Fouts follows them in that. He takes over integument, and the likelihood that he would come to integument independently without taking from more Aveling, that's basically zero.
Mm.
I would just like to mention for the audience, Moore Aveling is the first translation. And Engles looked over that one, right? While it was being translated?
Yes, he edited it with a heavy hand. So Samuel Moore.
So we're on number 3, which is the Reitter version. It'll go down in history as such.
We're actually on number
Number
4.
number
I keep
4,
saying that. Okay.
as we established.
All right. I'm going to keep saying 3. You guys say 4. We have the Moore Aveling and the Fouts, and then another one.
So that has the effect of elevating the language in places where in the German it might have been more natural or conversational. They take some of those things and they elevate it and make it sound, I don't know, more distinguished, more academic, more scholarly, or just more technical.
How
was Engles' scholarly English?
Oh, Engles was very good in English. He wrote quite a few of the articles for the New York Daily Tribune that appeared as Marx's work.
Oh.
He was a widely published author in English, even though he didn't get credit for a lot of what he published in English. I mean, those guys were unbelievably polyglot. Their correspondence features a lot of back and forth, English, French, German, in individual sentences, multiple languages going at once.
Because Marx oversaw his own French translation, right, before he died?
Yes. That was the last version of Capital, Volume 1, whose publication Marx oversaw, the last edition, whose publication Marx oversaw. The French edition, which was finished in 1875. So the second edition, the second German edition, which I used as the source text for my translation, that was published in 1872. And basically immediately after that, Marx started working on the French translation. And the French translator, he thought, didn't do a great job. And so he worked it over heavily. But since we don't have the manuscript that the French translator, or the manuscripts that the French translator gave to him, it's very difficult to know in this French translation what comes from Marx and what comes from the French translator. He made some lists of things that he thought were really important and wanted to be in future editions. And so there you can say, okay, well, that's Marx, but, it's a really big text. And the lists that he came up with, it's not like, hundreds of pages of text there. So a lot of the time, it's really not possible to say, okay, this is Marx or this is the French translator. You just don't know. It's a little bit of a black box, a philological black box.
Well, all right. Bills and Paul, I thought we would sort of go back a step and maybe just sort of ask the first question we were thinking about, Pills, if that's all right with you, which is, how did this project come about? What is its origin story of you translating this text, the Ursprung? Where did it come from?
Well, it began in the classroom. I've been teaching this book in translation for a long time, and I was using more Aveling, also Fouts, and feeling that things that were important to me about the text weren't coming through so well in their translations, which have lots of merits and are definitely not like bad translations. Translators have priorities, and it's hard to preserve everything at once. Although
we need to sell copies, Paul. They're garbage. Okay. Throw them out. There's only one translation in town. It's #1 on Amazon when you search Capital.
Oh, great. Okay. So yeah, those translations they weren't working so well for me. So I I started thinking about doing my own translation. I didn't feel prepared for a while, so it took a while. I did some other translations. It's not a starter project, and I got to work with some really great translators, learned a lot about translation. And I finally felt ready, and so I decided to do it. So I probably started thinking about doing it in like 2007 or 8. And then it took like 10 or 11 years for me to feel ready. And then I started doing it.
Wow. You don't look that old, if I may.
And this is something you voluntarily did then. It wasn't like a commission or there was like a call for a new translation. You decided to do this to yourself.
All self-inflicted. Yes, yes. Um, there were, of course, things happening in the world that helped motivate me, that gave me additional motivation, a resurgence of interest in Marx after um, the financial crisis of 2008.
Mm.
In addition to that, the big Marx year of 2018, his 200th birthday. There's a lot of stuff coming out, and a lot of it, frankly, felt not so necessary to me. And I thought, God, there's all of this stuff coming out on Marx that, doesn't feel like super necessary. Books about Marx's trip to North Africa late in his life, this sort of thing. What's really necessary? A new translation of Capital. So, okay, um, nobody else seems to be stepping up. Well, I'll give it a try. What's the worst that can happen? Like it won't be very good, and I'll decide it's not it's not for me, this project. But I got into the work, and I was excited by it, and got some encouraging feedback, and so I kept going.
Great.
Mm. That's awesome. And that kind of answers my other question too, is like kind of why now and why Marx, why now? Why after 50 years we got the folks translation? It's got its shortcomings, but yeah, the 2008 financial crisis, there's a resurgence of interest. And of course, yeah, the sort of Marx revival stuff that came out around his 200th the 200th anniversary. Yeah, there's some important sort of contemporary moments that maybe called for a new translation.
And there's an old saying that a classic should be retranslated every 50 years. And there's something to it. I'm not sure. I don't know exactly what the logic of the saying is. I suspect the idea is that translations don't age very well. And if that's what they're saying, then, I don't really agree with that. But I
Mm.
still think that it makes sense. In the first place, translation, in the first place, what people are interested in, this changes. The scholarship around classics changes. Certainly, that's very much the case here. I mean, think of all the commentaries on Capital that have come out in the last 15 years, 20 years or so. Michael Heinrich's commentaries, David
Mm-hmm.
Harvey's commentaries, the uh, the Mega, this Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, that was actually started way, way back in the day by this Ryazanov figure, whom I mentioned, and then got a new life much later on. The volumes on Capital, they were published after Faust's edition appeared, and they were extremely useful to work with, and particularly in examining how Marx worked with his source material, which was a big part of the project. It's not something that people seem to notice that much, but it really engaged me looking at how Marx cites all of this English source material, factory inspectors' reports, health reports in the first place, what he does when he cites this stuff. And I tried to be fairly sparing in commenting on this because I didn't want to overwhelm the reader with commentary. But there are, if you uh, if you you look in the footnotes and the endnotes, sometimes there are bracketed insertions in the footnotes, editor's note, and then sometimes in the endnotes, this comes up, how Marx is translating this material into German. I'm a translator, so of course I'm interested in translation. I'm interested in how Marx translated. And there are a lot of moments where it's interestingly hard to know what's going on. Is Marx doing trying his best to translate effectively? Has he made a mistake by leaving something out? Has he left something out by as a way of massaging the evidence a little bit? Putting his finger on the scale, which he sometimes clearly does. So, for example, there's a factory inspector's report that he cites where the original English says the smell was almost unbearable. And if you were to back translate into English what Marx's translation has, you would have the smell was unbearable. So what happened there? Did Marx leave out a word? That happens in translation all the time. Did he decide to leave out the almost because it makes the situation sound, a little less worse than it does when you say the smell was unbearable, right? Almost unbearable. It's not as bad as unbearable. And the point is to point up how horrible these industrial conditions were. So, you could see that he has motivation for doing that. And as I said, there are some cases where he pretty clearly massages the evidence a little bit. Or does he think that this is the best translation because the almost unbearable is like a little bit of English understatement that doesn't work so well in German? And so the best thing to do to match what's in the English is to leave out a word, which, sometimes is the right thing to do. And when you're translating from German to English, you almost always leave out words. Look, German really likes little words that are sometimes used for purposes of rhythm and cadence. And if you translate all of these little words, your English is going to sound really cluttered. And so, I leave out some of the little words that Marx uses. Faux leaves out some of the little words Marx uses. So, sometimes you leave out words going the other way as well, English to German, by design. And so these moments I found really interesting, and the mega edition was helpful for looking at the source material and what Marx did with the source material, and so I commented on that. I tried to do it sparingly, where it seems to affect the meaning of these passages that he cites, or where it's kind of characteristic of his way of doing things.
Sparingly, but you're forgetting to mention another huge selling point of the book. There's about, 150 pages of endnotes. So if you think you're just reading Marx, no. But I know Eric's going to want to talk about the mega project.
I had a question about that, but first I'd say I think it's okay because the situation today is becoming unbearable. And so it's okay if you leave out almost sometimes there. And then for my own thinking too, it's an interesting moment because people, capitalism seems to be shifting today. And I'm thinking of, people kind of looking at what's coming next. And so you have someone like Yanis Varoufakis out there talking about like neo-feudalism, the ascendancy of platforms. Whereas I think it's also legitimate to actually see maybe capitalism really actually coming more into its own today than ever before. It's not becoming something new. It's actually maybe intensifying. I don't know. Open question. But I think that's part of the context. This is a well-timed translation in that area as well, because, the situation is becoming a little bit unbearable, especially in the United States, what's going on in politics, and also here in Canada. But yeah, that's just a little comment.
It's funny if you look at the some of the Marx work in the 70s, like the Faulk's translation, which again came out in 1976. Mandel says in the introduction he doesn't think capitalism will last another 25 years, and the relevance of the book has to do with that the fact that capitalism is so, in part, the fact that capitalism has revealed itself to be so unstable, and um, uh, and maybe this book will play a role in pushing it over the edge. But of course, now, uh, from our perspective, this era in which Mandel was writing and other Marx scholars who were pointing up his relevance in similar terms in the 70s, from our perspective, this post-war era of uh, relative little inequality in the U.S. Not to suggest, of course, that there wasn't tremendous inequality, but relative to what there is now, it was quite different. It can easily feel as though we're closer to the world that Marx was writing about in 1867 and 1872 than people were, 50 years ago. And people have made that point. That's not my point. That point was made a lot in the 2018 anniversary year when there were lots of biographies published and everybody was talking about Marx's relevance, sometimes in very breathless, rather superficial ways, sometimes with more historical perspective and insight. There's a very good biography by Sven Erik Liedman, who starts out by talking about 2018 and 1867 and the affinities there, and how in some ways there are more affinities, thicker affinities than there are between 1976 and 1867, and that makes some sense to me for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking too, the kind of what we've been in the 20th century, we've been experiencing this kind of New Deal welfare state capitalism. And that seems to be completely coming apart today. I mean, people have been talking about this since the 80s under the heading of neoliberalism, and they're complaining that all those checks and balances and safety nets of the welfare state are going away, and this is such a bad thing. We need to keep those around. But then I think of Marx saying, capital will overcome any barrier you throw in its way. It's constantly overcoming whatever any limits to capital are going to be overcome. So again, I just see it as capitalism coming into its own a little bit more, and maybe the people who want to kind of reform capitalism, make it into a nice capitalism, are the ones who go on about neoliberalism. But again, my private commentary.
Oh, please. It's welcome for me, and I'm sure for your listeners as well. And I think that yeah, of course, one of the main points of this book is that you're not going to tame capitalism. That in order to have meaningful change, you have to abolish capitalism, or it has to abolish itself, or some combination of the two, which is for him the likelier scenario. And the book is not. He has a somewhat complicated perspective on reform. For example, there is quite a bit of discussion of the English factory laws and how they came about, and the push for them and the push against them. And he embraces those changes. It's not like he's saying, well, anything that makes things better in the short term and thereby um, allows capitalism to keep going longer because workers are a little less aggrieved. Um, that's not his perspective. He thinks that this is a good thing, that there are limits on the workday, and that the exploitation has been curbed a bit. And he's not suggesting that capitalists are doing this because their hearts are bleeding for the workers. There was worry about a workers' revolt, rising anger among the workers. That scared them. There was also the recognition that the human resources of English society were being destroyed by capitalism, that the height and weight standards for the military had to be lowered because people were, not as healthy as they had been under these conditions. And so,
Mm-hmm.
not saying that this was happening at altruism, there was also outrage, middle class outrage. A lot of people really believed that what justified imperialism, the imperialist project, was that Great Britain was a civilizing force in the world. And if that's how you feel, and then you hear about some of the industrial abuses going on right around you, 6-year-old children being made to work 12, 15-hour days, well, it's hard to reconcile those two things. And so there was also middle class outrage that was intimately connected to, something very violent and non-altruistic, namely, this whole project of colonial conquest. And so Marx is definitely not saying that this all just came from a good place, the factory legislation, but he does embrace these changes. And so it's not as though, well, we shouldn't be trying to make things better at all. In the short term, we should totally keep our eyes on the prize, revolution. But he also clearly thinks that this is not going to make things fundamentally better. And there are some complicated points in Capital that have been much discussed and misunderstood about the conditions of the worker and whether workers can get to enjoy their own products and rising inequality and these kinds of things, which we can discuss if you're interested. But sometimes it sounds as though Marx is saying that the workers will always become just poorer and poorer, and that's not really what he's saying. He recognizes that their situation can get a little better under capitalism, but he insists that it's not going to get that much better, and that inequality is going to increase even as this happens.
This reminds me a lot of what your co-editor Paul North writes in the beginning, that even though this is a very well researched and it's in some ways a very technical book, it's also fueled by a kind of anger, or he's upset at the sense of injustice and believes that can be changed. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, that's I think a really interesting tension in the book. This tension between a desire to present a very systematic critique of capitalism that's not what Marx says, or that's not based on, as Marx says, sentimentality. But then there are these moments of outrage where Marx and what Marx wants to argue, does argue that these abuses that he's documenting so extensively that they don't really, in the end, have to do with whether the will of the individual capitalist is good or bad. This is not a bad apples problem. This is a systemic problem. Capitalists are forced to behave as they behave. But then there are these moments where he looks at particular abuses by individuals whom he finds particularly repulsive, and he just says, can you believe this shit? Can you believe this guy? And you could say that that doesn't cohere perfectly with his desire to present a non-moralistic critique of capitalism. But I think that's something that actually makes the book more powerful. That he's not able totally to make good on this commitment that he has.
Well, it's a perennial debate how relevant the book is, and I just want to mix it up a little bit here, because we're saying relevant, nothing's changed. Of course, it's the most important book ever. But you've been in this book now for like 10 years. Can you speak to anything that you find? And I'm asking because, Marxist critics will say all the ways that this book is irrelevant or that it's wholly irrelevant. But I'm wondering if you found through here anything that really seems passé or no longer applicable, or to give some credence to, there's two sides to this, to the relevance of this book today.
Um, it's all relevant.
Okay.
You need to read it.
I guess with that question, like to like sections of Capital that have received maybe more emphasis. Um, I'm thinking even since the new readings of Marx emerged in like the 60s and 70s, certain areas of the book have received like more emphasis than others. I'm thinking specifically of like the first few chapters. I think Michael Heinrich will say this a lot, like previously, I mean, like 100 years ago, you know, the first four chapters maybe weren't regarded as quite so essential, or they were maybe passed over a little more quickly. Whereas I guess today in the discussions, they're much more central. Like those first few chapters are super difficult, but they lay out some of the basic conceptual groundwork that's going to be with us for the next 1, 2, 3 volumes. So maybe the question in that sense is what has changed in emphasis when we're reading Capital, and does that affect translating Capital?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, right, you asked about relevance. Well, one thing that people dismiss as not being relevant is this so-called labor theory of value. People see it. If you ask academic economists about capital, that's likely what they'll bring up first. That the labor theory of value just doesn't explain price. That we have a much better way of explaining price now. It's something that you get even from people who are very enthusiastic about Marx. In addition, from getting it, in addition, excuse me, to getting it from people who want to dismiss Marx, and that's what they bring up. You get that also from people who are very enthusiastic about Marx as well. So it tells you something about how widespread that view is. But I find it very exciting.
Is this what inspired this? I don't want to say angry, potentially this angry 3-page endnote about Ricardo and how Marx is not a proponent of the labor theory of value?
Yes, yes. And here, to some extent, we're inspired by Michael Heinrich, who's a very well-known value theorist at the moment.
And he's a manager or an editor, right, or a consultant?
He was on,
editorial board. Sorry.
Yes, our external advisory board there. Really a great friend of the project, and extremely generous with his time, and very patient and very open to disagreement. Marx circles are famous for there being
their friendliness and openness to differences of opinion, right?
Right. All views matter equally. Things can get kind of tense and heated and sectarian and all of that, even after the decline of what Mikhail calls worldview Marxism, and certain orthodoxies have kind of fallen away. But that doesn't mean that, these discussions are warm, and to use the word you mentioned earlier, cozy. But Mikhail is very open to disagreement. In any case, and that's one of his many virtues, he makes the argument that this idea that Marx is primarily trying to explain price with the theory of value, this is just wrong-headed. And so the people who dismiss the labor theory of value as essentially as a flawed theory of price, they've got it wrong. What Marx is trying to do, rather, is to explain what happens to our labor under capitalism, and explain how the market works as a social phenomenon. Mikhail sometimes calls it a social theory of the market, and that's something quite different. And he thinks that value can explain some of these things, but he's then, not primarily talking about price. He's talking about something else. And I find these discussions really interesting. I find the language around value really interesting. And that certainly was one of the things that motivated me to jump in, the sense that these aspects of the book didn't matter that much to previous translators, who therefore didn't put a lot of themselves into translating the language around value. That seemed to me to be um, a non-prioritized area in the previous translations, and I wanted to bring out more effectively what is really going on in the German, in these parts of the text that are really important for important contemporary discussions of capital.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
I
want
think
to?
on that note of value, is that where you're going, Pills? More value questions?
Why don't, if you're going more general, I have basically one giant specific question, but we'll start with your general value question. I mean, just to comment on it, I know like people think of Marx as the class guy and the anti-capitalist guy, but I like even more than class. It's all this whole book's about value.
Mm-hmm.
Value is at the center of things.
Class
Absolutely.
is like a relation to value. It's not Marx the theory. Anyway, yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think this is behind what I was thinking about with the first few chapters. One of Michael Heinrich's complaints is that the earlier English translations aren't very careful in the first few chapters. There's instances where the same German term is translated sort of in different ways. And so I guess as a reader, there's the possibility where you're reading the same word in German because you're reading it in English. You don't know it's the same term because it's sort of inconsistently translated. I don't know if you agree with that, if I'm getting it right. But the first few chapters is where a lot of this language around value comes in.
Yeah, this is where he introduces his concept of value, and in chapter one, early on in chapter one, and then he keeps expanding on it, developing it, as he would say, to the point in chapter four where he reveals how surplus value is produced. That
Mm-hmm.
he has made the reader wait for. He has this, style of not introducing concepts until he gets to a point in his discussion of the previous concept where it becomes necessary to introduce the further concept. And it leads to some interesting moments in the text. It's a kind of thinking that a lot of people, are not going to be used to. And he'll say things like wages from our current standpoint don't yet exist. And, it's not unreasonable to wonder, like, what is going on? Well, that's what's going on, this process of unfolding. But Marx
Mm-hmm.
sometimes really leans into this and um, lets the suspense mount. So you don't get to a definition of capital until chapter four, um, and where Marx reveals how surplus value is produced, and he,
Mm-hmm.
sets that up as a big, mystery. And it's kind of, I think it's exciting the way he does this, and satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Tells you how surplus value is in fact produced. But value is definitely at the center of things in this book. And so for that reason, it can seem very strange that somebody would want to talk about the book and its importance and bracket value. One definition of capital here is that it's essentially value in motion, value that's becoming larger
Mm-hmm.
than itself. And you could say then that capital is value. Well, then, what is the sense of talking about capital without talking about value? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a difficult discussion, as you say, and of course, that's one of the reasons why people want to get past it, and making
Mm-hmm.
arguments for leaving it out, because what exactly value is. Um, that how where does this value come into being? There are debates about that, ongoing debates about things as basic as that. Where value comes into being? Does it come into being when things are being produced? Does it come into being only at the moment of exchange? That's like a live, ongoing debate
Mm-hmm.
among people who are very learned about this book. And so that gives you an indication of, uh, how difficult it is to, to
Mm-hmm.
work your way through that. At the same time, I think the convolutedness of this discussion, I think it has multiple sources. I think that Marx is still trying to figure out what exactly this value substance is, how exactly to frame it the best way. The sections on value, they changed a lot from the first edition that was published in 1867 to the second edition that was published in 1872, right? So, this value is in motion in more ways than one. He's reformulating things pretty fundamentally. And so that's one of the reasons for the difficulty. He's using different figures that don't necessarily line up very well or readily. But at the same time, I think that he's also trying to communicate to the reader that this through not exactly the convolutedness of the discussion, but perhaps how intricate it is and full of paradox, something about the world of capitalism. Part of the point of this is that this is an effect of the world of capitalism, this intricateness, this obscurity, this intricacy, this obscurity, and that we could have much more transparency, much greater transparency if we stepped outside of capitalism, which relies on value to regulate social relations. There was, before capitalism, more transparency in social relations and economic behavior, and there could be much greater transparency. So, he's, I think, playing up some of these things that make it difficult as a way of conveying something about capitalism and the weirdness, the opacity of capitalism, that plays a role here too.
Yeah, I have some more value questions as well. Pills, you want to go next?
No, you do one more, and then I'll ask about Verting.
Verting, yes.
Yeah. Well, mine touches on that sort of thing. That Gegenständlichkeit, translating these value terms is something that your translation does a bit differently than previous translations. And that big one, Wertgegenständlichkeit, I guess that was earlier translated as the objectivity of value.
This is why I felt so betrayed by the Faux translation, because I'm always reading this, the object of value, and then you're saying it's supposed to be a technical term, and he doesn't translate it technically. We have all these other technical terms people will be familiar with, like use value and exchange value, and then the translator just decides to betray this one. I for one, I was shocked. I can't believe Faux would do
outraged.
Well, Faux he's still going. He's still translating other things. He's translating. I heard recently that he's translating Hilferding, so you can get in touch with him and make your opinions known to him. It is interesting. He's not that he would translate these terms as he does, because he's certainly not shy about using technical language in Capital. And yet these terms that are new terms, neologisms, terms that Marx is creating, they are rendered in some cases as everyday phrases, as paraphrases. So Wertkörper is translated as, which is a neologism or a near neologism, is translated as objective value, as Wertding is as well, value thing. Sometimes it's translated as objective value as well. And Eric, you alluded to that earlier, how different terms in the German are sometimes translated with the same English term. And that, of course, can be confusing. Sometimes Faux helps you out a little by putting the German in brackets, but sometimes he doesn't.
Can I ask you, just sorry to interrupt, can I ask you just a question of an English person who looks at a German text? all the nouns are capitalized. There's all these compound words that are kind of normal words. How do you tell when something's supposed to be a neologism as opposed to just a weird German noun?
Well, there are some nice tools. I mean, this is another thing that is another reason to translate a book every 50 years. Advances in technology can help you out. So here, you can put these terms in Google Ngram Viewer, and you can see, when they gained currency, and you can tell then from that whether or not these are just strange looking terms, or in fact terms that Marx basically created. And the neologistic character of these terms, I think, is important for a number of reasons. One of them being that it conveys, perhaps more vividly than anything, how much originality Marx is attaching to his own theory of value, right? So he is drawing on Ricardo and Adam Smith. They had a theory of value, or a labor theory of value, rather. And Marx does believe that under capitalism, it's labor that creates value. Labor is the value creating substance. But he also thinks that he's discovered some fundamentally new things. And he's in uncharted territory here. And that, therefore, of course, there isn't really a language to name the things that he is pointing to and analyzing. And so he has to create his own terms to do this. It's a potent evocation, I think, of that aspect of the text that really gets lost when you don't translate these terms as neologisms. Also, you don't see some of the relationships among the concepts as well when you don't translate them as compound nouns. Marx sometimes uses value, the German term for value, Wert, as a kind of prefix. And so have like regular Gegenständlichkeit, just Gegenständlichkeit, and then you have Wertgegenständlichkeit. You see the relationship between those two things, with Wert functioning as a prefix that suggests that Wertgegenständlichkeit is kind of an anti-version of regular Gegenständlichkeit, which has to do with the objecthood of physical objects, whereas Wertgegenständlichkeit has to do with the object of non-physical, special value objects that exist only under capitalism. When you translate Wertgegenständlichkeit as the objective character of commodities as values, which Faust sometimes does, that conceptual pairing gets lost, and the argument becomes follow.
Yeah, I had another question in this direction. I think I was first exposed to this conversation or a version of it in Michael Heinrich's commentary text on the first few chapters. I was happy to see in your translation, specifically in chapter 1, part 2, is called "The Double Character of the Labor Represented in Commodities." And Michael Heinrich points this out earlier in his commentary. The previous versions, the Folks and the Moore Aveling, they say embodied in commodities. The German term is dargestellt. So you see in the Moore Aveling, that chapter is called "The Twofold Character of the Labor Embodied in Commodities." In the Folks one, it's the dual character of the labor embodied in commodities. And now in your version, you have the double character of the labor represented in commodities. And Michael Heinrich argues that this is the better translation, represented. Embodied suggests something a little more concrete and different, whereas represented in isn't quite so corporeal as embodied. But it's just another one of those weird things about how value relates, or at least how say, labor gets into commodities as abstract labor and value.
Yeah, I mean, there is this basic challenge that Marx is talking about a non-physical thing using like very physical terms to talk about it. Like it's contained in commodities. Um, it it has uh, objecthood. It's a gelatinous blob. Right after talking about how it's ghostly, he
Oh,
talks
this
about
is the Jello thing too.
the
Oh.
Jello thing. Yeah, he goes from talking about it as ghostly to talking about it as likening it to bone marrow, basically, which is,
Mhm.
about as little ghostly as you can get. So, I mean, this is how one of the reasons why it's so challenging to go through this value argument, and one of the reasons why, even though Marx makes it clear at times that value is not a physical thing, um, people get turned around and they start talking about it as a physical thing. And
Mhm.
if you go a little bit farther than what the German text does, and you say embodied where Marx is saying represented, then you are, nudging people in the direction of thinking of it in as more of a physical thing than
But
Marx.
it's also not a physical thing though, right? It's concrete, but not like you can pour into a beaker, but it's a social form which makes it real as opposed to an actual ghost. Ghostly as opposed to a ghost.
Mm.
Yes, well, it's Paul North sometimes talks about it as a quasi-metaphysical substance.
Mhm.
Michael, he sometimes talks about it as kind of like a third sort of thing. It's not just a mental abstraction
Right. Yeah.
idea. Um, it's not a physical thing either. It is the result of a real process that's happening in society, and it's as real as anything else. Um, but it doesn't have physical reality in the way that a physical object does. The term real abstraction is, I think, helpful in this context. So, real abstraction, as opposed to um, uh, a mental abstraction that we use
Mhm.
to help ourselves make sense of the world. Another challenge in the first chapters of Capital is that there are two kinds of abstraction being discussed. There's the abstraction that Marx uses to understand capitalism. So, this is why he's talking about concepts one at a time, because he's abstracting and just looking at one thing, abstracting away from everything else. And then there's the abstraction that happens under capitalism, where the particular qualities of things are abstracted away so that they can become commensurate entities exchangeable for one another on the market. And it's not always that easy to keep these different levels of abstraction straight and see where, okay, this is an abstraction, a procedure of abstraction that Marx is doing for the purpose of understanding capitalism, and here's the abstraction being understood, the abstraction that's the object of inquiry, rather than the analytic mechanism being used to understand capitalism.
Whether it's abstracted in its social context or whether it's being abstracted for the theorist in order to explain the social context.
Exactly. Yes. Well
So,
put.
so this is like more of the stuff that we normally talk about. But I wanted to ask you about this one term. We have objective value, which is the bad word now, and then value thing, which is the good word. And it's supposed to be a specialized term. I never knew that, but that kind of changes that I think that alone differentiates your translation from the previous one, because that changes the meaning in a huge sense, particularly because philosophy has had this big upheaval, I guess, with the subject-object dichotomy. In the 1980s, when Descartes becomes the most evil man who ever lived because he's a substance dualist and all this. But when you were talking about object versus thing, I couldn't help but think of another one of Marx's biggest fans, Martin Heidegger, who who discusses. Well, he's got a big bone to pick with this kind of dualism too, and object, because it's got its Latin origin, and dealing with the object implies the subject has a confrontation with the thing, as opposed to his concern with, less subject object world pictures. I know that's probably it's a wrong term to use in that context, but he's all on about das Ding and this thing that is like the Icelandic parliament or whatever the fuck he's talking about at that part. But it does give you a less scientific maybe perspective on what the thing is. So maybe to use what I said before, it feels more warm to be like the value thing that pulls in other things from the world around it, as opposed to the commodity as some sort of object that we can put on the table and cut it off from its world context and then understand it. Is there any of that sort of debate? And obviously Heidegger was just one guy who said it, and then the rest of the hermeneuticists and phenomenologists took it in their own directions. But is there any of that object versus subject debate that made its way into the other translation that's maybe being fixed here, or is that a completely separate issue?
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I also want to thank you for the comment, and I think that's a really great illustration of how translation can matter, because you have associations with terms, and it can open up avenues of discussion that weren't there before, or that wouldn't have been opened up before. Associations in this case with Heidegger and Heideggerian reckonings with certain philosophical problems, and you maybe see connections that you didn't see before. And it's this is not to suggest that this is the only possible way, that my way is the only possible way to translate this term. It's actually just a very direct way of translating the term, but it's gratifying to hear that it has this kind of that it can have this kind of effect. I was thinking about Fuchs's attachment to object and objectivity, and whether that is a way that he is trying to emphasize the scientificness of Marx. Maybe it's not something that he was totally aware of himself, Fuchs, that he was moving in this direction. The more Aveling translation for Gegenständlichkeit, by the way, is not objectivity. It varies. Sometimes it's reality, sometimes it's value. And objectivity, of course.
Isn't that so crazy? There's like, what is it, Gegenständlichkeit, and they call it reality? That sounds very strange to me. It's like value objectness, reality.
They really de-stranged the text there. And, I think maybe it had to do with first translation pressures. I mean, Marx was not that famous at the time. Engels was clearly worried about alienating his audience and wanted the book to be as accessible, not simply accessible. He didn't simply want to simplify Marx or make the book less challenging. I think
he just knew that English speakers have a terrible imagination.
I think it was
tolerance.
The weirdness of the book that concerned him, that he was in trying to make it less weird. In any event, I think that may be at play there. So with object of value, Fuchs translates both Wertding and Wertkörper, two terms that actually have opposing meanings, in my view, with this same phrase, object of value, although he uses other terms as well to translate value. Wertding, also not neologistic sounding. I think his first translation of it is a thing possessing value, which is, that's basically a definition of a commodity, a thing possessing value for Marx.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't get at what Marx is really trying to get at with Wertding, which is again this, this duality, or this doubleness, right? That under capitalism, things are themselves and the opposite. A commodity is a thing, a physical thing, but it's also the opposite of that. It's this non-physical Wertding. That's what he's
explain. Why does the Körper? Why is that an opposite? Is that body, like value body?
So Körper, Wertkörper is the opposite of Wertding because it has a very different function in the expression of value. And a Wert and a regular thing and a Wert thing, they are opposites because the one thing is a physical thing and the other thing is a social thing. And that's a very important opposition in Marx, the physical and the social, the natural and the social. Not always just in opposition. There are natural social things, but this is an opposition that Marx makes a lot of here. The physical thing and the social thing. And he thinks that people under capitalism, they confuse the two all the time, naturalizing the social, naturalizing a social organization, a mode of social organization that for him is anything but natural.
That's crazy. So the Körper is the natural aspect.
So the Körper is the natural aspect, except that when Marx uses this term value, Wertkörper, or value body, again, translating very directly, it's not a hyphenate in the German, it's just a compound noun. I translate it as a hyphenate, but it's also a neologism. There he's not talking at all. He's not talking about what he's talking about when he uses the term Wertding. So the Wertding, right, is like, and again, it's hard to get your head around this because it's such an oxymoron. It's a thing that's not a physical thing. It's a hunk of abstract, objectified human labor, as opposed to concrete labor. And this is what happens to our labor under capitalism. It's made into this blob of undifferentiated labor, so that we can have exchange amid, like the anarchy of an unplanned market system. And the Wertkörper, that for Marx is a physical body. So in this case, he's using Wert, not quite in the same way as this prefix that suggests anti, that suggests that something that suggests that something isn't physical, as he is when he talks about the Wertding and Wertgegenständlichkeit. Here, when he uses Wert, here being Wertkörper, he's talking about in the expression of value, the body that does nothing but express the value of a different commodity. Value, one of the peculiarities of value for Marx is that it's this non-physical thing that needs to be expressed through something physical, that is expressed through something physical. It's expressed through its opposite, essentially. And that also, makes for lots of confusion, as you would expect. And the Wertkörper, this is a technical term for Marx that names the thing in the expression of value that is the thing, the material through which the value of a different commodity is expressed. In his example, the example that he really likes, the linen and the coat is the Wertkörper. The coat is the physical body that in this expression of value does nothing but express the linen's value. The linen makes the coat into its value mirror. That's another metaphor that he uses there. And so to translate Wertding and Wertkörper with the same phrase, object of value, that doesn't help people keep all of this stuff straight and follow the argument.
Mm.
That is so cool. And none of this is in the original, folks. This is why everyone, you gotta throw out the old copy. This is making me horny. And we have to end now. So.
This is not in Faux.
Ditto.
This is not in Faux.
No.
Not in More Eveling either.
I think I'm getting a vert corpora, if you know what I mean.
I think we're approaching the end of our time.
Yeah, with the last question, or last question plus Eric's follow-up, we have what do you call it? 2.5 volumes of Capital. This is only the first, or 3. Are we gonna go to number 2 after this, or you need to take a break?
I am planning to do the other ones. Yes, 2 and 3.
And then write 4 as your own opus.
And then 4 is going to be fan fiction. Yes.
All right, on.
Yeah.
Extended universe.
Excellent.
Yeah, there'll be a unicorn on the cover, no doubt.
And I guess just the follow-up question to that is, what's the state? Like, what are you looking at with the materials for volume 2? Like, what are you working with? What are the philological challenges? They're going to be a bit different from volume 1, I presume.
Yeah. Volume 2 is a different philological challenge, a really interesting one, I think. So Marx wrote 8 volume 2 manuscripts over about 15 years. And the main one that Engles used for the edition that he published in 1885 was the second volume 2 manuscript, which Marx did right after he did the first edition of volume 1. So from like 1868 to 1870, that's when he did this second one. But the last one, he finished manuscript 8. He finished in 1881, and so that's quite a bit later. And he was doing a lot of rethinking as he worked on the second edition of Capital, as he worked on the French edition of Capital. That was a big reason why he didn't get to revising volume 2 for publication. And then he had some, personal tragedies. His daughter died, his wife died, and it understandably slowed him down. And he, well, as we know, didn't publish the other 2 volumes. And Engels did after he died, and after Marx died in 1883, so 1885, and then the last volume 4, came out just the year before Engels died. This is 1894. So this is 1881. This is the last part of Capital that Marx was working on. Volume 3, that manuscript comes from much earlier. In fact, that's the first manuscript that's based mostly on the first. That's based mostly on a manuscript that Marx wrote first of the various manuscripts that were used for the 3 volumes of Capital. So 3 is in a way the oldest, and 2 is in a way the youngest. And that's exciting. That's an exciting thing about 2. But the philological challenge is one major one would be to allow readers to see what Engels did as he stitched together a single volume out of 8 manuscripts, with the explicit goal of making it read like, an integrated whole, a finished product. Engels, in his introduction, front about the state of these manuscripts, but then he also says that he wanted to make it sound like a finished manuscript. And one way he did that was to really flatten the style. Unfortunately, the manuscripts were a lot livelier than the volume that Engels published. And so one of the challenges is to allow readers to follow what Engels was doing, his editorial moves, where he, finished things. I mean, he finished passages at times that were just kind of left broken off by Marx. So allow readers to see what was going on in the editing process in that regard, but then also maybe to let this livelier style of the manuscripts shine through. It's very hard, to preserve a certain level of stylistic liveliness. Um, and of course, this is the stylistic liveliness that I experience, or as I experience it. It's not like, something that exists there um, to objectively to the point where we can all like agree upon it. It's, something that takes shape during your reading experience. But it's hard to preserve exactly what you encounter. There's the tendency to, go up or down, to make it a little livelier, to make it a little less lively. And in making these decisions, I'm going to let myself be guided by the style of the manuscripts, and it's going to become a little bit livelier. So that's, in a nutshell, my plan for volume 2 and working with these 8 manuscripts, which came out, which were published in the Mega long after the most recent English translation of volume 2 appeared. So the translator there didn't have access to these manuscripts, and couldn't follow Engels's editorial moves in the way that you can now, and didn't have a sense for what's going on in the manuscripts, of course, stylistically, in the way that a translator can, can now. So
that'll be exciting.
It sounds like you got your work cut out for you there.
Have you got any feedback so far on your version, this version?
Yeah, we've gotten some very enthusiastic feedback. It's getting a lot of course adoption, which is really gratifying because, we definitely did this with students in mind. Unsurprisingly, there's been some complaining too. Some people wanted a more like straightforwardly, Marxist revolutionary framing, and
the Leninists.
Yeah,
we love them though.
The traditionalists, yeah.
Traditionalists.
They miss their favorite terms popping up in English.
The psychology of retranslation, I think, is really interesting when it affects me directly in this way, in the form of people, expressing skepticism about my translations. Maybe it's, a little less interesting, but I like to think that I can step outside and just look at the phone. People become very attached to certain formulations, even if they're very well aware, even if they've been made aware of the inadequacy of these translations. This is the Marx you've experienced. You had incredibly meaningful, informative, intellectual experiences of Marx, with Marx, in these words. I totally get how you can form a deep attachment to certain phrases, even, when you're aware that maybe there's some problems with them as well. And you just, you understand the arguments for the new translation, but somehow it just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't feel natural. Sometimes it takes a little while. So I was definitely expecting to get some resistance for that reason. Also, because of the lack of revolutionary political framing. And then, it's translation. You can question pretty much any move, and I'm happy to have those conversations where people say, this makes sense, I suppose, but this other translation would have made sense as well, maybe more sense. I'm happy to have those kinds of conversations. I haven't had too many of them so far, frankly, and it's just it's just something you have to put up with as a translator, or turn away from the discussions that people will take the big text. And and here, I suppose it's also kind of a special case because there is a tendency to build whole interpretations of the book on individual formulations. And so people are going to be very protective of translations that support their interpretations. I heard, for example, that John Bellamy Foster expressed publicly some reservations about the way the term Berauben is rendered in a well-known passage. And he wrote a book called The Robbery of Nature. And I don't translate it as robbery. And, so, it's not surprising that he would push back against that. You would like people to give you a little more credit as a translator. Of course, I understand that robbery and Berauben, or that rob and Berauben are cognates, but the cognate is not always the best translation. And if you show me a translation that always translates cognate, goes for the cognate possibility, I'm pretty confident that you'll have a somewhat unimaginative translation. So in German, there are three words for rob. There's Rauben, Berauben, and Ausrauben. And Berauben doesn't actually line up so well with rob in terms of association and register. It's actually a pretty polite term, a quite literary term. And in fact, if you look, going back to those, I mentioned the translations earlier that Marx does for Capital, translating English source material into German in the body of his text. Another reason to look at that carefully is you can learn a lot about Marx's usages by looking at what he does with English words, putting them into German words. So there are a number of cases where he translates phrases like deprive as berauben. Bellamy Foster's problem with my translation, evidently, was that and I translated berauben in this case as steal, is that steal doesn't imply force as the way that berauben does. But that's more of like an ausrauben thing. Berauben, as I said, is a polite term. It can mean to deprive. It's often used with a very like elevated genitive construction. And so again, there were these problems of association and register that I was trying to take into account in not translating it with the cognate rob. And, you would like for people to give you a little more credit and not assume, as I sort of think he did, that I just missed the cognate possibility. But that happens. It's something you have to put up with as a translator.
It's a bit like fan culture when you've got your favorite book and it's being made into a movie and then they get some stuff wrong. Oh my God, Lord of the Rings left out Tom Bombadil. The whole thing is ruined.
I mean, come on. They left out. But evangelicals still think that the King James Version is the only good version of the Bible because it sounds fancy. So,
and even Michael Heinrich has gotten pushback for his mega project work from, I think, more orthodox Marxists, even saying, we don't need any of this philological stuff. We've got Marx. It's total. It's complete. We know what he meant. We don't need any of this sort of mega project stuff that Michael Heinrich is doing. I've seen him engaged in debates that kind of strike that tone a little bit. And again, it's a kind of a, I don't know, maybe there's a parallel in the psychology to fan culture a little bit, but sometimes you got to ignore the fans.
I'll say for the project is that I gave it my best shot. I worked very hard on it. I think that as I said, some people have suggested that this is like a social democratic edition of Marx, probably the press, Princeton, has something to do with that as well. In addition to the framing, it didn't come out with like Verso. Then the second translation came out with New Left Review Press, which was kind of a Verso version. And that history is still there. You can see it underneath the Penguin imprint. So there's that as well. But I would say to people who feel that way about this translation or were tempted to dismiss it for those reasons or in that spirit, look at the actual translation and see if you think that there's a politics, a social democratic politics to the word choices, and look at the passages, the most rousing, revolutionary passages, and see which translation makes more of an effort to convey the revolutionary energy there directly, and which translations use, like integument right before the expropriators are expropriated, and also that passage muddle the causality a bit as well, so that the sequence that Marx is talking about becomes much harder to follow. So, yeah, that's what I would say there.
Well, you're mistaking what these people are actually like, because you're telling them to do some work. They don't like to do the work. They like to complain about things and then explain to everybody how virtuous they are relative to everyone else. So I think you just put them off by saying, why don't you compare translations? Because that involves opening 2 books. Anyway, we are at time. So
yeah, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, guys.
I want to thank you, and
pleasure.
Thank you, and the great state of Ohio. You guys need a new senator now, I guess, right?
Yes, we need a new senator. I've heard that Ohio is one of the words of 2024, and evidently it's taken on the sense of like bad and weird. It's used that like when you say, "Oh, that's so Ohio," that means that that thing is not a good thing. It's a term of disparagement.
Well, up here in the 51st state, that hasn't entered our slang yet. But no, I thought from Hillbilly Elegy that capitalism was doing just fine there. Actually, not the case.
Yeah, Columbus is becoming a center of modern capitalism, having to do, I guess, with where it's located, and also it has this combination of state capital, research university, land to be developed. So Amazon and Intel building huge facilities here. Maybe that also was in the back of my mind when I started doing this book.
Sounds great. Sounds utopic. Anyway,
that's awesome.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Well, that's awesome. Definitely pick up a copy of the new translation of Volume 1 of Capital, because it's fantastic.
Look at that typography, folks.
Being a sycophant, it is great. I'm really enjoying it, working my way through it.
Forward by Wendy Brown, another selling point.
And afterward by William Clare Robert.
All right, and with that, we will say thank you for tuning in, and we will talk to you at you. We'll talk at you next week. And thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks.
Cheers.